So today's the Ticket's birthday. If you live in Dallas-Fort Worth or any kind of sports talk radio fan, you know what the Ticket is. You know what they're all about. If you are a P1 or ever worked there, this will be especially interesting for you. And on this episode of Confessions of a Gen X Mind, this is how I came to be an employee at KTCK, The Ticket, way back in 1999, what that experience was like, and how it shaped my career going forward. I'm still a proud P1, still love The Ticket, even though it's kind of unrecognizable these days from what it once was. But check this out, let me know what you think, and check out all of our episodes on Amazon, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get podcasts. Enjoy. This was the spring of 1999. Yeah. Spring 1999, I was a UNT student studying radio, TV, and film. I was living in Denton, and I was commuting for my day job at the bike shop, making $7 an hour. And for most of that time in the bike shop during the week, I was by myself because the weekends were really the most busy time at the bike shop. So during the week, I was alone in the shop, filling in for a manager. I rotated between 3 different stores. So for the manager's day off, I would come in and work the store and do what needed to be done, fixing bikes. But mostly during the week, I was assembling new bikes. So pulling them out of the box, putting them together, putting them out on the floor to get sold. And since I was alone for most of that time, I listened to talk radio just for something to keep me company. And it was originally my sister, who was a traveling nurse who did home health visits, who turned me on to The Ticket because she did so much driving and she really loved sports. Originally turned me on to The Ticket. I had never heard of it because in 1999, it was only about 5 years old. So I started listening to The Ticket at work. And, I loved it. I mean, I wasn't a huge sports fan, but I lived in Dallas-Fort Worth. So the Cowboys and the Rangers, but the Cowboys specifically, were really inescapable. And in 1999, they had still had some recent success. So the Cowboys were still a really big deal. Troy Aikman was still around. All of the guys that had won Super Bowls were basically still around. The Cowboys were still a hot topic, and I was always interested to hear what was happening with the Cowboys. Listening to The Ticket was just something to pass the time while I was alone doing work, building bikes. So my favorite shows, I think at the time, my first favorite show was the Chris Arnold Show with Corby Davidson as the producer, and then the Rocco Pendola Show, which people will laugh, but he was a character for sure, and he got a lot of shit at the station and kind of got suckered into talking shit about management by The Rant and Gordon Keith, who is a whole nother story. But so that was my first introduction to The Ticket. Eventually, I had seen an ad for the Ticket promotions department. If you listened to the station at that time, you knew who Rodney the Behemoth Nemeth was. He was the promotions director at the Ticket. His famous spot would say, "Get a slightly used Ticket t-shirt," if you know what I mean. Because at the time, the Ticket was doing a lot of promo appearances at cabaret establishments, shall we say. In fact, I had submitted my application and my resume, which didn't consist of anything at that point. I had worked at Radio Shack and mowed yards at that point and built bikes. So I had just come off of, kind of a wave-off career attempt with Radio Shack. I had worked there for 5 years and had planned to get my degree in radio, TV, and film and then go to work in their corporate media department. But then I realized what an awful corporate experience it was working for Tandy Corporation / Radio Shack. So I quit my corporate America job early in 1999. I got the job at the bike shop. As I was studying radio, TV, and film and getting interested in talk radio, I really wanted to go and work for a radio station. So I don't know, 3 or 4 months went by and I didn't hear anything. I had submitted my application from my AOL.com email address. And eventually I heard back from the Ticket, and they wanted to interview me for a promotions position, driving the Ticket Hummer and handing out t-shirts. So I went and had my first meeting with Rodney Nemeth at some gentleman's club. I don't even remember. Cabaret Royale, that's what it was. And so that was my first introduction to the Ticket. So I got my $6 an hour job handing out t-shirts, driving the Ticket Hummer, and that was in August of 1999. And as a matter of fact, I started that on the same day John Engelman, for our very first remote altogether. Engelman and I started, I want to say on the exact same day. But anyway, it was at the Circle R Ranch out in, I don't even remember where it was, in Denton or somewhere over there. But we drove drove the ticket Hummer there. We were handing out t-shirts and doing this guys' night out remote at the Circle R Ranch. And the funny detail was there was this giant inflatable balloon. It was called the Big Ticket, and it was like a cheerleader and like a giant ticket. And so the only way to make any extra money beyond your $6 an hour was to help set up this ticket inflatable. And if you touched it to put it up, you got $50 talent fee. And if you helped take it down, you get $50 talent fee. So I learned that pretty quick. And that was my first experience at the ticket. So I did promo for a while and eventually realized that it was hardly even worth the gas money to drive from Denton to downtown Dallas or to wherever the remote was going to be. So I really, as I saw the limitations of being a promo guy, I started chatting with the engineers that I would meet at the remotes. So first, and most famously from the Hardline, it was this guy, Steve Porcari, who was seemed like a pretty aspirational figure for me because he was doing the job I wished I was doing. So I would kind of watch him do his gig and look and see what that entailed, and realized it was something I could certainly do because I had some just knowledge, some hobby knowledge from being into audio and guitar stuff and sound equipment. So I understood that I could probably just walk on with some training and do that job. And those jobs paid double what the promo guy made. So if I made $6 an hour, the engineering guys made $12 an hour. So I talked to Steve Porcari. I talked to a guy named, and I can remember my very last remote as a promo guy was the Dallas Mavericks home opener at Reunion Arena. I want to say it was probably 2000. It was shortly after Cuban had bought the team, and he walked up and did an interview with the Hardline, which was kind of, for me, inspirational in a way, because it was this guy we'd heard about on the news who made his $1 billion and bought the Dallas Mavericks, and he was this tech dude, this tech bro in jeans and a t-shirt, billionaire, walking up like, hey guys, you want to interview me? So that was my last experience as a promo guy. And shortly after that, I was able to make my way into an interview with Rob Chickering, the skydiving chief, the guy every engineer looked up to because he was the coolest dude. He was like a skydiver and had been involved in the X Games and was super smart and just this brilliant engineer. And behind all of the technical greatness of the ticket up until that point, to go to work for him, get offered a job was a dream come true for a tech nerd and a talk radio fan. Rob was the guy you wanted to impress, at least from my point of view. And engineering assistant, remote technician job was super competitive at that time because we were all just part-time at-will employees with no benefits or anything like that, or no guarantee of hours each week. So you kind of went into that job knowing that you could have plenty of work one week and none the next, or be mowing the grass at the transmitter site if there wasn't any remotes to do. And it was a really competitive environment because we all wanted to impress the skydiving chief because he was in charge. He was the chief engineer of the whole cluster. So you really wanted to be on his good side and demonstrate to him that you were solid in your ability to solve problems and take the station on the road and have minimal supervision, because that's really what it was all about. If you could make it through a gig and not have to call the chief, you're doing all right. I always took pride in being able to do that for the most part. It was really competitive, and so you kind of had to be a little bit cocky to be an engineer. Like it was a bunch of young guys in their 20s with all that comes with that. It was very fratty, and it was very like everybody was just really competitive and accused each other of being, oh, you're just so cocky. But you kind of had to have a certain level of confidence to take this equipment and deploy it, and then also have a thick enough skin to be working with these high-paid radio hosts who had a whole host of ego and issues themselves, and you kind of had to avoid being thrown under the bus on the air to all of Dallas-Fort Worth. You kind of had to develop a certain level of confidence to where they wouldn't mess with you. But when I think back on it now, I feel like it's kind of hilarious that we were all being so competitive trying to get this one full-time gig that was available. So to move up from being a remote technician, the next step up to your entry full-time job was the remote coordinator, which made about $30,000 a year and had benefits. So it's weird for me to think about what I make now versus how we were all clamoring in the year 2000 or 2001 to get this one job that paid 30 grand. That was, the amount of work you had to do and the amount of organization you had to have to get $30,000 a year. And we were all fighting to the death for it as if that was the only way. But to be working for the Ticket in Dallas and being a young sports fan / radio, TV, and film major, you kind of understand how could we be so competitive? Well, because the Ticket was like the big leagues, and to walk off the street to be a promo guy for a little while and then just to ride the elevator up 3 floors to the engineering staff on 16 and just walk in there and do a great job was a dream come true for me, and I know for a lot of other guys. And so I'll say for the most part, it was a pretty good experience, but it was easy to see the hierarchy. It was easy to see that, some of the older, crustier engineers like Bill Geiger looked at the younger guys coming up with a certain amount of contempt, with a certain amount of there's no way you're ever going to do this right, like constantly looking over your shoulder, which I understand. But I mean, my favorite picture of me at work, me bending over a remote setup, a board and all of the gear and the wireless microphones, doing my job, and Bill Geiger in the background scowling like I'm about to make a mistake or something. He's just waiting. So there was a certain level of that, like full-time advanced engineers like Bill and Hugh Beavers, and Armando was a younger version. He was a little bit nicer, but it was every man for himself there. And we were talking about the remote coordinator position, and that was kind of funny to watch too, because it was a revolving door there for a while. When I started, it was one guy. It was Heath. Bill used to always call him an idiot. Idiot Heath did this, and Idiot Heath did that. And then it was this guy called Matt that trained me when I first started, Matt Taylor. And his nickname was Panic Matt because I guess he was a kind of a panicker. And I guess maybe he kind of was from my point of view, but he trained me, and but I was happy to move to being a solo guy once I got trained, and he was fine. But Heath didn't last, Matt didn't last, and then finally the last person that was our boss or like our coordinator. I mean, the real boss was Rob, right? The chief engineer. That's who I considered that I worked for, but the remote coordinator handed out your assignments and made the schedule and all of that fun stuff. So you kind of had to get along with the remote coordinator. But ultimately, I felt like I worked for Rob, and that's who I wanted to impress because I wanted the remote coordinator's job. So, it was kind of a weird environment because in some cases, like, I don't know, it's weird to be more skilled than the person you're working for. And that was never the case with Rob. I'm talking about the remote coordinators, and they were all good at their jobs, but you couldn't help but look at what they were doing and say, I could do that and I could do that better probably, but whatever. And then finally, right before I left the company, after I graduated from UNT and the time was approaching where I really needed to get a full-time job, working part-time on a passion project like the Ticket wasn't going to cut it for rent and insurance and all that good stuff. So, this younger guy was hired as the remote coordinator when, at the time I felt like maybe I or someone else was probably more qualified, but he had got hired instead. And there was a little bit of bitterness there. Like, I felt like I would have been more in line for that job, but, management did not agree. And, come to find out they had varying opinions about me for whatever reason. And so that was kind of the end of that. But I'll say for working for the station, it was an interesting experience coming off the street as a fan and getting to see behind the scenes and behind the curtain of the radio station how it really worked, and to meet the people that you've been listening to on the radio all this time, see them in person, see who they really are in real life, and see how different their radio persona is from their actual real personality, which was interesting and sometimes disappointing. So I'll say, let's just do a rundown of who was working there at the time. even way back then, I think I started being a remote technician in the year 2000. That would have been Dunham and Miller in the morning. They were always pretty professional to work with, but they were all business. It was between 5 and 10 in the morning, and so there wasn't a lot of chatter. I guess they were respectful and nice enough, but they didn't really interact with you that much. They're not going to be your buddy on site. You're there to do the job, to get them onto the air, to make sure that they're sitting there when we come back from commercial. And so they were fine. Craig Miller was pretty quiet, but polite enough. And George Dunham, same, but we'll talk more about him later, because I'd say of all the people I ever worked with at the Ticket, only one radio host ever cussed me out on the job, and that was George Dunham. But that's another story. So Dunham and Miller were good to work with, but it was a really killer shift because you had to show up to pick up the remote truck at the transmitter site at 2:30 in the morning to make a 5:30 start time. So if I was going to be driving out to Flower Mound or to some golf course somewhere for Dunham and Miller, I'd have to leave Denton at like 1:45 in the morning, show up in Coppell to pick up the remote truck at 2:30 and head out into the dark with no GPS, just a maps go, a flashlight, and a crappy Nokia phone and a text pager. So that was always interesting, showing up at that North Lake transmitter site to pick up the equipment and to head out to the remote. It was a little bit later that Norm Hitchkiss came around. He was always great to work with. Norm was always really professional and always really fun and jovial, and he always remembered my name and was always super kind and nice and professional and like one of the best that ever did it there. Next up, I worked with Bad Radio quite a bit when they were still pretty new. This was like from 2000 to 2004. So they were pretty fun to work with. Bob was pretty much all business and didn't really talk that much to the staff. Dan was always really fun to work with, and he used to ask me on the job pretty much every time he saw me if I was high, which I never was at that time, but it was, I always found it pretty amusing. I still love listening to the Dumb Zone to this day because I think Dan as a radio personality is just the right level of quirky, and I've always really loved working with Dan. After that, I worked a whole bunch with the Hardline, first with just Greg and Mike, and that was always good. Mike Reiner was always a total pro. He was really gruff on the air, but actually pretty nice guy off the air. He always remembered my name for years and years afterwards. He used to announce my birthday on the ticket annually for like a decade or more after I left the station. So that was always fun. Grego was dealing with his own issues at that time that I didn't know about, but he was always super quiet and hardly even made eye contact with you, which, that was fine. But they were super talented and always good to work with. I also worked with The Ender, which was Doug Anderson and Mark Followell before Mavericks fame, and that was fun. They were really nice guys and young like me and just making a name for themselves at the station at the time, so that was fun. Also worked with the Ben and Skin show, the Mavericks post-game show. That was always fun. They were really cool guys, also young, and I've always rooted for Ben and Skin, whatever station they ended up on. Worked with the Rant a lot on the weekends. That was always interesting. Gordon Keith was an interesting character, and you kind of had to watch yourself with him, because he was, he was just an interesting character. We'll put it at that. So the Rant was fun to work with because it was always funny because he's a quirky, funny, dark humor kind of personality. So that was fun. So sometimes it would be Corby and Gordo, and sometimes it would be Dave Lane and Gordon. So that was fun. I worked with the T-Box quite a bit. That was Corby and Rick Arnett. Every golf course in DFW for a time, so that was always interesting, but way too early in the morning on Saturday. Eventually, Richard Hunter's Wild Ass Circus, which was interesting in and of itself, where we would go and broadcast in people's living rooms, like on Thanksgiving. We did that. The last time I worked with him was some weird remote in someone's ghetto house on Thanksgiving. Eventually, I think the very last gig I ever did with the ticket was I was the Dallas Desperados Arena League football road engineer. So I had started off the Dallas Desperados' initial season. They played arena football in American Airlines Center, and they were like a franchise of the Cowboys. And so that was an interesting experience in and of itself, getting to be on the inside of Valley Ranch and working with some of the Cowboys staff that were also on the Desperados staff. So I started out as an assistant the year before, running the sideline parabolic microphones and, dealing with that. And then the next year I got to be the actual road engineer and travel with the team, ride on the team bus and, ride on the plane with them, stay in the hotel, hang out with the players. That was a fun experience. It was like $250 for the weekend, but you got free hotel and, you could expense your meals and all that. So, it seemed like a good deal for a single guy in 2004. But it was working with Greg Williams and George Dunham as the play-by-play guy. And, we got to travel around to, like half a dozen cities. It was like New York City, Philly, Orlando, Phoenix, Austin. It was an interesting experience, and Charlotte was the one time that George Dunham cussed me. I think he cussed me out in New York City because that was totally my fault. I'd stayed out all night the night before in New York City, and, we were having trouble getting the broadcast on the air, and so he was rightly pissed at me for that. But there was another incident in Charlotte where we were having trouble with our ISDN connection, and went off the air, and he was dropping F-bombs and cussing me, which I'll have to say, I guess he's a benevolent guy now, and he's a longtime veteran at the radio station, and that's all great. But at the time, it was the ultimate professional test for me, because being cussed out at work, the highest pressure situation possible, wasn't something that really ever happened, except during that time, and I had to use the ultimate amount of restraint that I to this day, that I've still ever used in my career, because when you're in the ultimate high pressure situation and someone's cussing you out at work, it takes every ounce of restraint for a 20-something guy to not either retaliate in some way or to walk off the job completely, which is, for a split second, that's what I thought I was actually going to do. I was going to just walk off the job and leave it to them to bring the equipment back and say, hey, if you want to cuss me out, and treat me this way, then y'all can take it from here. You can get yourself back on the air. You can take this equipment back, screw you. But I didn't do that. I sucked it up. I held it together, and I got the broadcast back on the air. And after that, I had gotten a full-time job at Salem, and was able to get out of the very last game of the season and got someone else to do it. And I was able to just move on and never talk to George Dunham again after that cussing situation. And so it was 99% a good experience. It was just an interesting time to be in broadcasting, but still a dream come true, and still to have my name associated with the ticket in any way it's all good. And I'm really proud of the work that I was able to do there, and to see them still succeeding all these years later. It's great. Good for them. What made working at the ticket most intoxicating was proximity. You weren't just working at a station, but you were orbiting shows that people actually cared about. The Hardline, Bad Radio, The Ender, The Hot Spot. You saw how bits were built, how silence and timing worked, and how tension lived in a room. When Corby eventually joined the Hardline, it made complete sense. Even back in his producer days, he was one of my favorites. Corby, Danny, Dave Lane, Gen X voices, closer to my wavelength. I always gravitated towards the younger hosts and producers. They still had curiosity and they still questioned things, and that really resonated with me. So in talking about engineering, here's the truth. For a lot of engineers I worked with, that job was the destination. They loved gear. They loved the signal chain. They wanted mastery and stability, but that wasn't exactly me. Engineering for me was a step. It was how I learned timing, how I learned restraint, and how I learned to stay calm when everything was breaking and everyone was listening. I didn't want to stay technical forever, though. I wanted to synthesize everything. Working at the ticket was a passion project for me, and it was great. But the pay was awful, the hours were brutal, and the grind was relentless. Most people didn't last. Some stayed and hardened, and some washed out. Some went on to real success elsewhere in media and radio, and that's great. What makes me feel good now isn't whether I stayed, it's that I kept moving. Engineering assistant, broadcast engineer later at Yahoo, production, voice, editorial. To stay relevant and paid in the media over the decades, you don't just get to be one thing. You have to use everything that you learn. A real bright spot at the Ticket nowadays is a guy named Jason Kellison. He's in a position of management now at the Ticket, and like one of the guys that I worked with way back in the day and actually trained a little bit before I left the station, who stuck around all these years later to eventually ascend into a position of management. On the station, he's known by the nickname Killer, but I just knew him as Jason Kellison. Super nice guy, and there isn't a nicer dude who deserves it more than Jason. So I just want to say this isn't necessarily nostalgia, it's just context. So I'll just close with this. For anyone who ever received a paycheck from Susquehanna Falsgraph Incorporated in York, Pennsylvania. Anybody who worked at that Susquehanna Dallas cluster from the late 90s to the mid 2000s, big shout out to you, because no radio group ever did it better than Susquehanna. You can't talk about the success of the Ticket without talking about the people behind the scenes, the engineering staff, probably most importantly the board ops like Psycho Dave, who's one of only a handful of guys that I keep up with from those days, who's a super, super nice guy. And it's amazing to see how many people still remember Psycho Dave. Not only did he press the buttons literally and figuratively, but Dave's comedic timing with just the perfectly timed drop, following in the footsteps of Fred Norris on the Howard Stern show. The drop and the digital audio workstation, the Enco, made such an impact on the comedy and the tone of the station. You can't talk about the Ticket without mentioning guys like Dave. So big shout out to Dave and to all my former colleagues. Man, those were some memorable times, some excellence in broadcasting, and I couldn't think of a better place to have started my career than Susquehanna Radio Dallas. And the Ticket. This is Confessions of a Gen X Mind. I'm George Tenike. If you like what you've heard so far, check out all of our episodes on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or wherever you get podcasts. Or check us out at confessionsofagenxmind.substack.com for more. Thanks for listening. We'll see you down the road.